This is Antic, the Atari ST podcast.
I said something like, well, geez, I don't think I could do this for less than $6 an hour. And I knew immediately that I'd made a huge mistake. Not exactly threatening, but he's like, why don't you just fire me again? It was desperately embarrassing.
This is Antic, the Atari 8-Bit podcast. I'm Kevin Savitz. Gregg Pearlman was an editor at Antic magazine and Start magazine from 1986 through 1989. Antic magazine was devoted primarily to Atari 8-bit computers, with some emphasis on Atari ST computers. It was published from 1982 to 1990. Start magazine was dedicated primarily to Atari ST computers, with some emphasis on 8-bit computers in later issues. It was published from 1986 to 1991. This interview took place on July 12, 2016. In it, we discussed Jim Capparell, whom I previously interviewed.
I was interested in computers probably from the early 80s on, but I knew nothing about them. And the way I got to Antic was I had been working for Miller Freeman, which is another publishing company, not that far from where Antic was at the time. And I had been with them about 3 months, and the magazine I was on, they decided to discontinue. And so I just kind of started asking around. The art director at Miller Freeman, or at least the one for that magazine, had given me Jim Capparell's name. And so I just sent him a resume and I assume a letter on the off chance, and as luck would have it, they brought me in for an interview. And so I'm sitting across from four bearded men. There was Jim, Nat Friedland, who was the editor of the magazine, DeWitt Robeloff, who was, I guess he was the associate publisher, and John Lovelace, and I don't remember what his role was, but the four of them just kind of shot questions at me. And the thing I most remember was Jim looking down at my resume and saying, "You misspelled function." I spelled it F-U-C-N, and I'm going, "Oh boy, that looks good." And but they just kind of kept going. I mean, in an editorial position, you almost expect that's going to get you dinged immediately, but luckily that didn't happen. And at the point when they asked me how much I would like to make, well, I was very young and was only fairly recently out of retail, so I really didn't know what to negotiate for. And I said something like, well, geez, I don't think I could do this for less than $6 an hour. And I knew immediately that I'd made a huge mistake because I saw four sets of eyes get bigger. and I didn't know Atari was even around at the time I interviewed for the magazine. This is one of the least prepared interviews I can imagine.
Had you even read the magazine?
No, never heard of it.
Nice.
Knew nothing about it. I was just very new to journalism. I mean, that was my major in school, but I never thought I'd actually get any jobs in it. And by the time I graduated, I just kind of stayed in that major because I didn't want to find another major and have to keep going to school. It wasn't a great attitude, but it was the attitude I had. And so they did hire me. I guess I don't remember if they hired me that day, but they did hire me, and I was very pleased. And more or less as a condition of employment, I had to buy my first Atari computer, which was an 800 XL. And previously, my only extended experience with a computer had been this Texas Instruments like 99.4A or something, which I remember hooking up a cassette recorder to so that I could save programs. The Atari computer did it a little differently. The TI, when you'd try to save a program on tape, or load it. It made this weird barking noise until finally the thing was loaded after several minutes. And, all I really was trying to do with that thing was just silly little stuff, make it play a song or whatever. And so now I have this Atari computer, and I still know nothing about computers. And I'm looking through the manual after I brought it home. I had to buy an actual, the unit, the keyboard in which the computer was housed, and a floppy disk drive and a couple of floppy disks. Well, I clearly misread the manual because I formatted the operating system disk. Because I thought that's what they wanted me to do. I didn't know what format meant, So I really couldn't do much that night. And then I'm at work, I guess a day or two later. And the people I worked most closely with at that time were Charlie Jackson and Patrick Bass. Charlie was basically the technical editor for the magazine, and Patrick was essentially the technical editor for the ST part of the magazine. We didn't have Start magazine yet. And both of them and Bill Marquardt, who also was working there at the time, were very helpful because talk about Babe in the Woods. I just knew nothing about this stuff. And this was where I first used a word processor. And it was the word processor that we did the magazine on, Paperclip. And there's still some things Paperclip could do that aren't built in to other word processors, which is weird. But the three most useful commands in Paperclip were to switch letters, switch words, switch paragraphs. And I use those all the time. And, if it hadn't been for Paperclip, I might never have considered it. The other thing about Paperclip is that if a file got to be more than, say, 23K, it would freeze. So, you go back, think this is 30 years ago. I started in April of 1986. And, here I was working on that with, the computer was made out of rough-hewn granite. And it and I had a little TV hooked up, and it was just so primitive compared to now. I mean, we were using 5 1/4 inch floppies. There were a couple of STs, and they were being used primarily by, Patrick used one, and I don't remember who was using the other at the time. I had a little bit of experience with the ST, and it was a different experience. I'd never used a mouse before, for instance. In any case, that's really how it got started. I mean, I still think relatively often about just how slow everything was in comparison to now, and how little storage was needed or was available at the time. After I'd been at Antic a couple of years, I was given a hard drive to use, and I believe that was 10 megabytes. And, you can do a small Word file that'll take up 10 megabytes now.
Sure.
But that probably was the most fun job I ever had. Of course, because I got to spend a great deal of time playing games, which I then reviewed, or not. And I felt I got along well with the folks I worked with, and it was really a pretty nice atmosphere for the most part.
Nice. So, how long were you there?
Let's see, April '86 through or into July of '89. Right. So just over 3 years.
So tell me about, after you're settled in, tell me about the day-to-day there. What were you doing, and what was the environment like, and just kind of let's go through a day at okay.
Antic. Well, we worked primarily with outside submissions, and we, the editorial staff, wrote a fair amount of stuff. But the game scenarios were generally written by usually unsolicited writers whose work was unsolicited. There were some regulars, like J.D. Caston, Matt Ratliff, and us. And by the time I got there, I wrote a fair amount. But what would happen is there'd be like I don't know, just a cardboard box that was full of envelopes that had submissions in them. And I believe there may be more than one cardboard box, but I believe there was one that was the so-called bank, where if we really couldn't find anything else, then maybe we would use an article from there. But Nat would basically assign however many pieces to me to edit. I would very often edit a printout in pen first, then go to work in paperclip, and eventually submit it to Nat on the floppy. I think the heaviest edit job I did, somebody had sent in what was something like a 3,000 word article, and Nat had asked me to get it down to about 300 to put in as a letter to the editor. So I wasn't sure I wasn't sure that was very nice, because this person not only had his work cut to shreds, but didn't get paid for it.
Right.
But, these things happened. And so, I mean, there was a lot of what I did. I mean, basically just editing other people's stuff, writing my own. And, geez, I don't remember. I don't remember how many articles I wrote for Antic, but I had a couple of things.
84.
84?
Yeah.
I'll be darned. Well, one of these was about I really can't remember what it was. Jack's Jersey Atari computer something. I don't really remember, but they were located in New Jersey, and the guy who was my contact is someone I'm still in contact today. It turned out, we got along well when we talked, and it just so happened he mentioned the Beatles. I said I was a huge fan, and he said, "Well, guess what? I have tons of Beatles bootlegs. I'll start sending them to you in the mail on cassette." And I didn't know such a thing existed. So all of a sudden, all of these unreleased songs, I was the first kid on my block to have, and so I got a kick out of that. And it's just that it started with our contact through Antic.
Nice.
We're not really.
Bob Whipple, or
I don't. I guess I better say yes, because in the interview his name's right there, so I don't want to get him in trouble for the bootlegs. So it could be any Bob Whipple officer.
Sure. Right.
But yeah, and I had the opportunity to meet him in 1999, which is 10 years after I left Antic. It's the only time we've ever met in all these years. It's been about it must be about 30. And we are Facebook friends, though we haven't really been in touch a whole lot. He's a good guy, and there were, what was I going to say? There were just a number of those articles that were a lot of fun at the time to write. I do remember that there was one that I really didn't want to write, that Nat had asked me to follow up on. I didn't want to do it. It's not that I was being rebellious. It was just I was uncomfortable with it for whatever reason. And
what was the article?
He had given me, I don't remember, but he had, well, let me put it another way. I remember, but I'm not going to tell you. He had given me a clipping from a newspaper, And on the other side of the clipping was this fantastic recipe. And so that's what came out of that assignment, was this recipe that I still use. And I think I gave some idiot excuse to Nat. Well, I tried to call the guy, but he wasn't in, And in case Nat ever sees, no, I didn't feel good about it. But that was probably, as I say, it was probably the job I liked best, just because I was able to be creative. I mean, I had to do work, but I was able to be creative, and I kind of felt I was moving on to a career path that I could feel pretty good about. So I look at most of my days at Antic fondly.
Good. Nice. So let's talk. I want to talk about that box of software that came in. Is there anything that sticks out at you that you looked at this and went, "Wow, this is amazing," or you looked and go, "Wow, this is complete crap"?
Micro League Baseball was the first piece that I wrote, and I was thrilled because I'm a huge baseball fan, and I had long been looking for a game of the time, a baseball game of the type that I prefer, just that I could fool around with on a computer. So I did that a lot. I played it to death and wrote the review. And for people who don't care about baseball, this will mean nothing. But I had some phrase in there about how some pitcher balked home a run, or balked a run home, balk, B-A-L-K. And Nat, who, God love him, did not know what I meant, changed the word order to balked a home run, which in baseball means, nothing, but it sure made me look like a boob. So I wasn't entirely thrilled, but that's probably the main thing for me to remember about my first piece. But Nat gave me a lot of work, and seemed to appreciate what I was doing. And, again, I pretty much liked the atmosphere, and I liked what I was doing there. But your question was, do I remember seeing any software that just really made me go, wow?
Yeah.
And, at first everything did. Probably I didn't see anything really, quote unquote astonishing until I moved over to the ST side in 1988. But there were, I saw not only a lot of professional software, but a lot of software submitted by readers. And sometimes I had to write or rewrite a game scenario to fit. But I'm trying to think. I do remember using, it might have been VisiCalc, which was a spreadsheet program.
Sure. Which
was also something I had been interested in, primarily for baseball-related reasons, and so it was kind of my first exposure to that. But I would actually have to go through the issues just to kind of see what I did. After a while, it all becomes a little bit samey and jumbled together. So,
right.
I'm afraid I don't have any great details to answer that question. Probably
Okay.
Micro League Baseball was what I had the most fun with.
Sure. It's one of your first ones. Yeah, you did a lot of reviews, and you did some stuff on. You did an article about teleprompting with the Atari, and
yeah. I don't remember a lot about it. I remember doing that article, and it kind of rings a bell every time I hear teleprompter. But I don't remember what the article said, though. I guess somebody somewhere was using an 8-bit Atari as a teleprompter in like professional settings. That couldn't have been easy.
Right.
So
yeah. There was a few companies that actually, I've learned since, a few companies actually that did that.
Really?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah.
The computer certainly was capable of it.
Yeah. There was usually like a special knob to control the speed of the text flow, and it was kind of cool.
Right. Actually, I now can think of, if only I could remember the man's name. There was a gentleman who I guess came in once or twice. Nat, I think, knew him, but he had brought in a floppy disk containing music that he had made on the Atari that was, I mean, it was basically synthesizer music, but it sounded like a band. I mean, it sounded like legitimate non-computer music, and, that kind of made my jaw drop. Of course, by today's standards, I'm sure it was less impressive, but, I mean, that was a pretty impressive thing for this guy to be able to use an 8-bit computer to do. So, I just wish I could remember a little more detail about it.
Sure.
There was a gentleman named Lynn Schickowitz who came in the office periodically, and there was one thing that he put, I think we ran this on my computer, and if anybody else who was working there at the time in that room around my computer ever sees or hears this, then with any luck they will know what I mean when I say that I absolutely cannot discuss what Lynn Schickowitz put on that computer, although it was an animation. That's all I can say.
Huh.
But for some reason it sticks with me.
Maybe something not appropriate for a workplace.
I would go as far as to say the kind of thing that could get a person fired from a workplace in 2016.
Yeah.
And I remember my reaction to it, which was, okay, because what can you do? It was the last thing I was expecting to see, but
right.
You had to hand it to him because, people weren't doing a lot of. We didn't see much in the way of animation, from readers, and the animation we did see, of course, was in the professional software, and so for what it was pretty impressive, really. But that's you'll have to prompt me for other details.
Sure. No, I'm just kind of looking at your articles, and I was trying to see what I see. They stuck you with some of the big articles, like let's see, in 1988 there was the 3rd annual Antic Awards, which was just like a rundown of stuff, and then in 1989 there was the Christmas shopper's guide, and it's just like super long lists of things, and those must have been tremendous amounts of work.
Well, I mean, certainly time-consuming. As I recall, it was basically just boiling down press releases, which I had done at my previous job at Miller Freeman in my first exposure to magazine work. So in itself, it wasn't difficult, but there were a bunch of them. And that's about all I remember about the Shopper's Guide and Antic Awards.
And you did another article of interest to me in particular with about speech-related speech synthesis products, the Kovacs Voice Master and the Sound Mouse and stuff.
I remember the name Kovacs Voice Master, but I don't remember what it sounded like, or even if I heard it.
Not very good.
There was a young guy named Chris Meyer who I believe lived in Texas. And I'm trying to remember what it was, but it was basic. He was explaining. The equivalent term now, I think, is phishing. Phreaking. Phone hacking and phreaking is what he was talking about, and just his software and hardware that I guess were measures against it. And so I remember that being a fairly large piece. I'll tell you this, the piece I liked the most never got into any of the magazines. It did go into Antic Online, which was our CompuServe presence, because, frankly, it didn't have a thing to do with Atari computers. And That was an interview with Douglas Adams. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Sure, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'd only read his books 3,000-4,000 times by that point.
Mm-hmm.
And, was certainly a very big fan. He's still one of my favorite writers. And so, Nat, this is in 1987, I remember him saying, okay, would anybody want to interview Douglas Adams? And he didn't know who Douglas Adams was. My hand shot up immediately, and nobody else knew who he was either. So, I won that particular battle with no competition. And what was going on was he was going to be emceeing Software Publisher Awards at the Claremont Hotel in Berkeley. And so it involved me taking Bart to get across the bay, and early, I probably late in the morning, I sat down with them in a hotel room and just interviewed them. And the interview's still out there online somewhere. It was interesting because he was very, relaxed and funny and interesting. And after about, half an hour, 45 minutes, he gets a phone call, and it is the Joan Rivers people who, this is before she was replaced by Arsenio Hall on Fox, which she had a talk show. And whoever interviewed him asked him questions for probably another 45 minutes, and I'm sitting there, feeling kind of stupid and not realizing I really probably should have my tape recorder on. Because he's telling a lot of the stories he had already told me, but he's telling some other good ones. And then he was going to be on Joan Rivers the next night, which I don't remember what day of the week it was, but I remember sitting up late to watch it, and there were just these horrible acts. There was this kind of insipid interview with Robin Givens, and it was mostly Joan Rivers generating the insipid. And then a couple of really bad acts, and then the last person on was Douglas Adams, and, it's like 11:50 or whatever it is. And he was not really very relaxed in this particular interview. Joan Rivers had clearly never heard of him, knew nothing about his books, but one of the things about it was he was telling me about a book that he was about to submit to his publisher, which was Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency. Mm-hmm. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, I've read all the stuff, so yes.
Okay. And he says, you want to see it? And I said, oh, yeah. And he pulls a 3.5-inch floppy out of his pocket and says, it's here. Oh, thanks, He was very late with the submission, which I came to understand later was how he always worked. But I think of that day or two very fondly. It was really quite a thrill to meet the guy. I am not an autograph hound by any point, but I actually asked him to sign a book.
Nice. Very cool. Yeah. As you were telling me the story, I was Googling around trying to find that article, and I haven't found it, but I found it's referenced in several other places. Someone wrote a biography of Douglas Adams,
yes.
you are referenced there and stuff, so cool. Nice.
Mike Simpson, I think was his name. He contacted me and asked if he could use it, and of course this is 100 million years after the fact.
Sure.
And he used, very small portion of it, but I got it wasn't a mention exactly. It was more like an end note in the book, which was kind of cool.
Citation. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. But the thing about him, and again, this is not about Antic, folks, or Atari, so if you want, you can stick your fingers in your ears and hum Camptown Races until I'm done. I had contacted him shortly after the Hitchhiker's Guide movie came out. And I told him, I had just seen it and I wanted to know what he thought. And he pointed me toward his website where he just tore it in shreds. And with good reason. And it was the kind of thing that Douglas Adams would have been rolling over in his grave, sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And the biography, he actually sent me a copy, which was very kind of him. And I came away from it with the sense that Douglas Adams was a hell of a guy with the accent on hell. He sounded like he was kind of fundamentally a good, personable guy, but really difficult on his friends. And so that was, a little disappointing. But the book was good. So, this is me touting, I think it is M.J. Simpson's biography of Douglas Adams, which I cannot remember the title of. Sorry, Mike. But yeah, I guess I'll stop with the Douglas Adams stuff here.
All right. It was called Hitchhiker, a biography of Douglas Adams. Yeah.
Thank you, yeah.
Sounds like an interesting read.
It is.
Cool. So, all right, back to Antic. Have I wrung you of your Antic stories, or should we get into how your time there came to an end?
Customer service for Atari, as I remember it, was basically call Antic. They really didn't want to hear from you again once you were out the door with their machines. It really seemed to annoy them. And so they would call Antic, and they'd get funneled through to Charlie, and Charlie was a very kind, soft-spoken and patient guy whose patience was nonetheless tried by readers who'd been fobbed over by Atari. So it was always kind of, when his phone would ring, I would kind of stop working to see what was going to happen. Very often, Charlie ended up throwing the phone in his garbage can. After, as I said before, I was moved over to Start in 1988. John Bell had left his position as an associate editor, went over to Oracle. And John, incidentally, he can blame me for this, but if you get a chance, he might be worth interviewing because he was, a top guy at both Start and Analog. So, he sure has a lot of things to say. But John had left, and so I was moved over to Start, and so suddenly I'm working with an ST, and so that was very different, just because I felt that the word processor we used just wasn't all that flexible, and it wasn't as good as paperclip. But I think I was only there for on Start for a little over a year, and during this time, when I started there, Antic was something like 140 pages, and then gradually it just got smaller and smaller, I guess as the advertising dried up. And by the time I moved over to Start, I think it was down to 64 pages. And within a short time, it got it stopped being its own magazine and started being an insert in Start, which, was kind of sad. And let's see. The editor when I worked on Start was Andy Reese, and I believe it was his first job in a capacity like that. And it was interesting working with him because he had a varied and storied past, and he told great stories. And he and I got along. I liked him a lot. And trying to think what else happened. Oh, yes. I will not name this particular name. I'm sure some people can figure it out. But one of the editorial staff on all three magazines was fired, I think in '88. And it had to do with something. It was just really inappropriate. He needed to go. And I can say stuff like this because he's no longer alive, so he can't get me. And as he left, he, was just screaming at the powers that be who told him to take a hike. And I don't remember how he wound up getting out the door, but he did. And at that point, he packed up and moved couple thousand miles away on his bike, carrying his 17-year-old poodle.
Wow.
During the trip, the dog died, and what he would do is get to wherever he could get online and post something on our CompuServe page. And after he'd been gone for a while, he started posting some stuff that was just not complimentary toward the people who fired him, of course. But worse than that, he said good things about me, and I'm like, all that's going to do is get me in trouble. And he called me a few times. And then sometime in '89, I might have been a year after he left, he had called me to say, I'm going to be in San Francisco for, Comdex or whatever it was. And I wondered if I could drop by the old stomping grounds. I said, geez, I'm not sure that's a good idea. And had suggested very strongly that he call me first before he does any such thing. Because what I would have done was just met him downstairs and with any luck, not run him, past everybody upstairs. I mean, I don't think anybody needed the stress. I was afraid he'd go crazy. It was already a relief that he probably wasn't going to bring a shotgun with him. He was the kind of guy who was inwardly destructive, I think, not outwardly. And he did come. He showed up out of the blue. I knew he'd be in the area, but he didn't warn me. And so I received a call saying he's here to see me. And I go on downstairs. I'm like, hi, how's it going? Hey. And he's wanting to go upstairs. He's like a dog straining at its leash. I'm like, how about we don't do that? And he kind of gets past me, gets on upstairs. And he is sort of being introduced around because there's a lot of new people since he left. And he's giving it the old, and who are these lovely ladies? And I'm trying not to cringe visibly. And there was one woman who, she hadn't been there very long, but I guess she'd heard the stories. And she had these big brown eyes. And she sees him, and her eyes are open so wide in this expression of terror that, evidently he was not well liked by the women, because he had a way of either being really mean to them or very puppy dog-like in an effort to court. And so apparently there was a certain amount of dancing in the streets when he left, I'm sorry to say. But when he was in the building, he and I'm finally getting him to go downstairs. Down the stairs, come on. And Jim Capparell comes down from the top floor as I'm trying to get this person down the other, down the staircase underneath. And that's actually before we reach the staircase that I'm trying to pull him to. And the guy sees Jim, who is, as he always did, whistling a particular measure from the song Coming Through the Rye. It was just his habit. And he stops in his tracks as my former coworker is hiding behind a gondola that holds a bunch of copies of the magazine. And he goes, was that so-and-so? And I'm like, come on, down the stairs. And so-and-so starts yelling at him. and not exactly threatening, but he's like, why don't you just fire me again? It was desperately embarrassing. It was mortifying. And he's just calling him all sorts of names, and I'm pulling him down the stairs, and finally get him out of the building, and that was the last time I saw him. But of course, how do you follow that act? And I went up to Jim later and said, I had no idea he was going to do that. I am really sorry. And he says, oh, don't worry about it. What kind of surprises me is that I was one of the ones who wanted to keep him. So, clearly that's not how so-and-so saw it. The last thing I heard about him was that he had died in a car accident in, I think, 95 or 96. And, it's horrible to say, but it kind of fit. Although before that, not long before that, I had started working at Stanford School of Medicine, excuse me, and I got an email from him that said something like, a Stanford professor, can you sink any lower? And that's all it said, and that's the last time I heard from him. And of course I wasn't a professor at Stanford or anything like it, but that's a mistake that I've learned to my detriment a lot of people make when they find out you work at Stanford, is they think you're high-paid staff. Well, you can forget about that. The only person who makes money there is the football coach. So, but this particular person was, you could say, one of my mentors when I first got there. And he was very patient, and and he and I got along really well. It was just obvious that there was some kind of really weird stuff. So I will stop talking about him now.
Okay. So, all right. So Antic magazine was getting slimmer and slimmer, was folded into Start, and then eventually went away. And so now you're playing with STs. And then what? How did that come to an end for you?
Well, I was just simply laid off in July of 1989. I didn't see it coming. And, I don't think anybody was happy about it. And I can repeat a couple of things that were said in my conversation about it, but I would have to repeat those off the record, I think, because they're not... they're not entirely kind, and these are not necessarily things I said. Right. But I don't think he was any too thrilled about me leaving. Left him short-staffed, and when I was on Start, basically everything came to me and then went to the art department. Stuff would go to Andy. I think a lot of times stuff would go to me, then to Andy, then back to me, and then to the art department. And the first issue of Start that I had nothing to do with, there was a typo on the cover. So I felt kind of good about that. I know it's mean, but there was another magazine that came out during that time. I think it was before I moved over to Start, called Radio Controlled Model Shopper. Mm-hmm. And Jim it was basically about, remote control airplanes and cars and, and something I knew nothing about and cared even less, and basically everybody on our staff who wasn't in any kind of position of power felt the same. And we had received a memo saying, these are your new roles on Model Shopper magazine. They are to be carried out. How did he put it? I more or less carried out simultaneously with your normal efforts. Mm-hmm. So here we are suddenly expecting to be putting out another magazine. Mm-hmm. that none of the editorial staff had any interest in. One of them in particular was just, they worked him to death anyway, but he was clearly outraged at having these new duties thrust upon him. And he wrote an article about model cars, and he kept calling them things like model toy cars, and writing it as though the reader was 6, and saying, now make sure when you play with these model toy cars, you make sure your mom and dad are there, And the editor said, yes, I get it. You don't want to do this. Okay. And she just let him off the hook, which was the smart thing to do. That was Anita Malnick, whom I liked quite a bit. And there were eventually 3 staff members brought in to do that magazine because the first issue was done by all us computer people. I was credited as the exterior finishings editor. And like I say, I knew nothing about this stuff. But there's a friend of mine whose interests kind of veer over into that area, and I just said, well, how's this article look? And he said, yeah, not too many factual errors, which wasn't precisely what I wanted to hear, but better than it was terrible. But that was my involvement with Model Shopper, and that magazine kind of, I want to say died on the vine, but that's probably not fair. It didn't last long. I don't think it lasted more than 6 or 8 months. And what I do remember was that there was a cover used on, I believe, Antic, that wound up on the first cover of Model Shopper. It was a cover photo.
Huh.
And so, it was just altered to make it look, model-y instead of computery. And I'm going, oh man, that's weak. So that was when that happened, when Model Shopper went under. One of the editors, Tom Byron, was retained. The others were let go, and Anita Malnick had already moved on elsewhere. But Tom was retained, and he ended up, I believe, becoming the editor of Start. And he and I were basically the assistant editors on Start for however long it was, and he was a good work partner, good guy.
I was just looking at your last article published in Start was October 1989, and then you were laid off around there, and then... No, I was laid off the previous July. Oh, really? Oh, okay,
yeah.
So July 89.
Yeah.
And then the last issue of Start was the April 91 issue, so it really didn't go along too far without you. Less than a year.
I guess not. And then Jim started a magazine called Home Computing, and I don't know if that's while Start was in existence. And I think Home Computing lasted for quite a while. I think there was a Mac magazine and a PC magazine, but I know nothing about either one.
Right. I remember one being Mac Home Computing.
Yes,
Mac Home.
That's it.
Yeah, I wrote for him a couple times.
Did you?
I did. Yeah.
So did you already know Jim?
No, that's how I met him.
Okay.
And then I recognized...
No, that's not what I mean.
Yeah.
What I meant was, is that how you knew him before your interview with him for your podcast?
Yeah. So I first met him because I was a writer for his magazine, and then I recognized his name on the masthead. It was like, oh, are you the Jim Capparell from Antic? And then, so this is many, many years ago. I got permission from him to put all the Antic magazines online. We digitized them all.
Was that you?
That was me at AtariMagazines.com.
Okay. I mean, I remember corresponding with somebody asking, you want to tell me what you're up to. Was that you?
Yeah, it sounds like something I do.
Because
there's a page. No, that sounds definitely like something I do. There was a page on the site called Where Are They Now? And
right.
Yeah. So that was probably me. And Now I have to search my old emails. And so, yeah, I found I was working for him, and then we started the Antic thing, and then now here we are.
Okay. Well, I will say that when I was on Antic, I liked the staff we had. It was primarily Nat, Charlie Jackson, Patrick Bass, and me. Bill Marquardt was there also, but kind of in a part-time capacity. And those are the ones who were there, who actually worked there. Gigi Bisson was there for, I think, the first 6 or 7 months that I was on Antic. She was the assistant editor before I was. On Start, I liked that team a lot. I had already gotten to know Frank Hayes, who was on To Computing, which was the Apple II magazine that Jim put out before Start came along. So I mostly worked directly with Frank and Andy Reese and Heidi Brumbaugh, and they were all a font of information. I enjoyed working with them.
Good.
So, yeah, I mean, I was not pleased to be laid off. I really wasn't.
Yeah.
But I know that these things happen, and, it's just, at the time it was a lot worse than I would have expected. But, I stayed in touch with many of them for quite a while after, and I'm still in touch with John Bell and Charlie Jackson. That's pretty much it. But that's how it ended. I mean, from there, I wound up in a couple of. Well, let's see. From there, I ended up at a defense contractor, where the boss was thrilled to hire somebody with magazine editing experience, and then spent the next 3 years trying to change everything about me. So that was the experience. The work experience was good. The office experience was horrific. And then from there, I ended up in a couple of office jobs, mainly the one at Stanford, where I worked for 10 years. And I am back in an editorial capacity as a tech writer now, and I've been doing that for about 4 years. I had not applied for tech writer jobs for a long time because I thought, nah, that's too technical. I don't really know that stuff. And then once I got a job at my current workplace, I kind of thought, this is the kind of stuff I've been doing for over 25 years. Why wasn't I applying for these jobs before? So that's kind of what I'm doing now. It's mainly editing, not writing, and the subject matter, I'm sorry to say, is tremendously dull. But good people, good company, and it's probably the most satisfied I've been in a job since my first couple of years at Antic. So, hey, I'm thrilled, frankly. I'm delighted to have the job. I'm grateful for it, and this is a good company that will, I think, be going places for quite a while. And, the kind of work I do is the kind of work that my coworkers at Antic could have done in their sleep. So, in case they ever find themselves wanting in. But anyway, so that's just really it. I mean, I don't know how scintillating all that was, but
no, it was great.
Great. Good. I mean, that job was really important. I think just in my professional development, and I basically have fond memories of the place, except for losing the job. So, I'm grateful to them for having given me a shot to begin with.
Nice. All right, last question. If you could send a message to people who read Antic and Start magazines And you can because they're listening to this podcast. What would you tell them?
Basically, hi, if you read my stuff, thank you. If you like my stuff, thank you even more. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity to do what I did. And I guess one thing I might want to say is that I am amazed that they are still, that they, and I guess you, are getting life out of the 8-bit Atari. And it's not just amazing, but it's a testimony to tenacity. And so I hope that you folks will continue to experience enjoyment with the 8-bit Atari, which, was certainly an important computer to me. Do you have any other questions? Can you think of anything else you need to know?
No, I think I'm good for now. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Okay, well, yeah, I hope I won't come off too badly. And, I hope whoever hears it will enjoy it to some extent.
I'm sure they will, because I certainly did.
All righty.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
All right, Kevin. Thank you. Take care.
If you enjoyed these interviews and would like to contribute something, I encourage you instead to donate to one of our favorite organizations, the Internet Archive, at archive.org. The Internet Archive is a nonprofit digital library with the stated mission of universal access to all knowledge. They've done incredible things to preserve computer history, including hosting thousands of programs in an in-browser Atari emulator, creating the Wayback Machine, and offering full-page scans of countless Atari computer books and magazines. Make your tax-deductible contribution at archive.org/donate.